So now you know what happened to Mary Oliver when she disturbed a nesting female alligator. They make these large nests of rotting vegetation and lay their eggs right into them. And as the vegetation decays, it creates heat, and that warms up the eggs. And then the female gator sits on top of it and keeps really quiet. And if anything comes along that might eat those eggs, like a raccoon or a bobcat or a coyote or a visiting poet from Massachusetts, they drive it off. So that's the biology. There's also the poetry, which we'll get to. But first I want to do Jesus. And that's not as big a leap as you might think. Give me a moment. Now, the Jesus I'm referring to comes from the very first chapter of the Gospel of Mark. Mark is actually quite stunningly different from the other three Gospels because the way he tells the story, there's no Bethlehem, there's no star, there's no wise men, there's no shepherds, there's no flight to Egypt, there's no slaughter of the innocents. There is no backstory. It begins with John the Baptist standing on the banks of the Jordan River doing baptisms as he did, and Jesus just shows up. He's a grown-up. That's the first time we ever bump into him in the Gospel of Mark. And he asked John to baptize him. Now, something amazing happens when he undergoes this ritual, this very, very ancient Mesopotamian ritual. And I'm quoting from the Gospel of Mark. No sooner had he come up out of the water than he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. Immediately afterward, the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness. He was with the wild beasts, and the angels looked after him. When this wild Jesus comes out of the desert after 40 days of living with the beasts with the oversight of the angels, he returns to Galilee. He recruits the first of the apostles, and he, quote, entered a synagogue and began to teach. This is remarkable because Jesus was almost certainly illiterate. He began to teach, and his teaching made a great impression because, unlike the scribes, he taught with authority. Now, this account from the gospel is so brief and so economical, it requires a certain amount of unpacking to get sort of the full significance of what's occurring here. When Jesus rises out of the water, the world he has known shatters. You'll notice the phrase is, the heavens were torn apart. This is not sweet or nice. It's very violent image. And through this destruction, the Spirit, in the form of a dove, descends upon him. And there's something about the descent of this Spirit, whatever it is, that makes it impossible for Jesus to go back to the world that he knew. And driven by that Spirit, he retreats to the desert for 40 days. He goes into the wild. Now, the wild is that zone that lies outside human control and intention. It's the place where human power fails and the illusion of any kind of control vanishes. In the wild, Jesus enters the mind and soul of the animal. He is with the wild beasts. He goes into what is instinctual, and the angels watch over him. So he is, this larger force is observing this transformation. Because when he comes out of the desert, he's a different person than he was when he went in after this particular vision. He teaches, quote, with authority. That is, it isn't that he's doing some kind of well-known or conventional or orthodox approach to whatever it was he was teaching, but he taught out of his own being. And significantly, the Gospel of Mark doesn't say what he said. It says only how he said it. So the really important thing that happened to Jesus in that place was that he has been so transformed that when he goes into a synagogue, this illiterate who may have been a carpenter teaches with such power that people pay attention to him. And this is all because of this experience that he had in the Jordan River. Now, it might seem that Jesus coming up out of the Jordan and fleeing into the desert doesn't have anything to do with Mary Oliver disturbing a nesting female alligator in the Florida Everglades. But they're actually crucially similar experiences. The world Mary Oliver knew before that encounter with the alligator is torn apart. It is shattered. She even laughs at her isolation before this incident. She says, quote, "That's how I almost died of foolishness in beautiful Florida." You know, that beautiful Florida is like something out of a tourist brochure. And she's really saying, I bought this thing. This is beautiful Florida. I can just walk in here like it's Disneyland. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes this gator. And it just misses her, which they typically do. They don't really want to engage you. They just want to scare everything out of your insides. And, you know, a lesser poet would have stopped right there with a gee whiz, that was a really close poem. Okay? But Mary Oliver doesn't. That's one of the reasons she's such a remarkable poet. She follows her feeling, the sort of soul experience of this thing. And she says, quote, "In the end, this isn't a poem about foolishness, but how I rose from the ground and saw the world as if for the second time, the way it really is." Mary Oliver watches her world reassemble in the same way that Jesus sees the desert, the Spirit come down in the form of the dove, and watches it then come slowly back together, and it drives him in the desert. She says, similarly, the water, that circle of shattered glass, healed itself with a slow whisper and lay back with the backlit light of polished steel. You can see a mirror forming in that water. And then she says, the birds, in the endless waterfalls of the trees, shook open the snowy pleats of their wings and drifted away. And so to hold this particularly precious moment, this instance in which she watches the universe blow apart and then reassemble, but it looks different, she picks these little wildflowers and she holds onto them. And she says that in her hands, they glitter like fire, which is both transformative and transitory. It's going to go away. Wildflowers don't last real long. So Oliver has entered into the wild, and she has been transformed. And in the same way that Jesus speaks with authority, so does Mary Oliver. I mean, she wrote the poem, right? And then we all pay attention to it when we hear it read, because we know there's something in that poem that has a particular power that tells us something about ourselves and our world that we would not otherwise know. Now, where Jesus and Mary Oliver come together is that the experience they had, the one in the Jordan River and the other in the Florida swamps, is a mystical experience, or sometimes it's called a moment of cosmic consciousness. If you feel a rise of New Age revulsion at the phrase mysticism, please give me another minute. William James, the philosopher and pioneering psychologist, wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience over a century ago, and he was no mystic. I mean, I'll tell you right flat out. But he did recognize that mystical experiences were real, and he was able to characterize them. He wrote down, like he was a scientist and a psychologist, what happens when someone has a mystical experience. And the first thing about it that James noted is that a mystical experience is ineffable. That is, it defies description. You notice that we know what happened to Jesus before he got into the water in the Jordan, and we know what happened when he came out of the water, but we don't really know what happened in that very important in-between. The same thing with Mary Oliver. We know what's going on when she's in beautiful Florida before the gator comes rushing past her, and then we watch the water reassemble and the birds take off from the trees. But we don't actually know what is going through her at the time that there's this enormous fright and fear, and this very intense emotionality that's going on in that experience. That is typical of a mystical experience. You can kind of know the before, you can kind of know the after, but the actual thing that happened in there, the person knows in a way that defies words. And often what the person has experienced confers a deeper knowledge or insight. Both Jesus and Mary Oliver understand something they didn't understand before. And part of it is that the world that they have understood, they have been living in, has both deepened and widened. They begin to see that everything around them, every being, every non-living being, is somehow connected. That's why Jesus goes and lives with the beasts, and Mary Oliver picks those wildflowers and holds on to them. She's recognizing a common ground between herself and the beings around her. Mystical experiences are often extraordinarily transitory. They last seconds, minutes. Very practiced mystics like Rumi or St. John of the Cross, maybe they could make it go for 15 minutes or half an hour, but that's about it. It's really brief. And the other thing about mystical experience is you can't make yourself have one. You remember, it's beyond human intention. You can prepare, you can pay attention, but the actual arrival of a mystical experience is just completely out of the blue. So there are, monastic orders that work very hard on currying a receptivity, but you can't make it happen. And in fact, the sort of precondition for understanding a mystical experience is that you have to be receptive, but you can't make it occur. The other thing about mystical experiences that James sort of talks about, but hits me as even more important in a Unitarian Universalist congregation, is that mystical experiences and some tradition of mysticism can be found in every single world religion. It doesn't really matter what it is. Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Taoists, Buddhists, they all have some kind of tradition around mysticism. And it's found in many, if not all, indigenous religions. And the curious thing is, if you read accounts of mystical experiences, they often sound very much the same, no matter what tradition that person comes from. The Baal Shem Tov was the founder of Hasidic Judaism. And if you read about him dancing in the forests of Poland when he was filled with God, it sounds a lot like an Inuit shaman being dragged under the ice by the seal mother and having his body broken apart and spat back up on the ice. I mean, there's a similarity of this, the before and the after, the way Jesus is moved. All these sorts of these mystical experiences, when described by the mystics who experience them, they sound very much the same. In fact, mystical experiences even happen to atheists. You may know the writer Barbara Ehrenreich, who wrote Nickeled and Dimed. I mean, she's a really well-known muckraking journalist. And she was trained in science. She's got a PhD, I think, microbiology. And when she was 17 years old, she said she was a cradle-born rationalist and an absolute atheist. And at the age of 17 in Lone Pine, California, she saw the world dissolve into flame. Now, that's a mystical experience, and she's an atheist. And she's actually written a book about it. Because what it points out to her is that there's something going on here that's bigger than simply a belief in God. The word mystical has often been, it's kind of almost become a slur. I mean, I've heard it used, in political discussions of, oh, that's a mystical idea. It's kind of a put down of some kind. It's somehow, it refers to the suspect and the superstitious. And as for the word cosmic, unless it's being spoken by Neil deGrasse Tyson, it sounds a little bit overblown. And the truth of the matter is that mystics in all of the traditions have often had a hard row to hoe when they make themselves known to the world of politics and religion. They're outliers. Think about Jesus, for example. We tend to think of him as the supposed founder of the Christian church. But if you were a Jew in first century Israel, you realize that for him it did not go well once the Roman Empire figured out that he was a threat. Same thing like John of the Cross, who was one of the Catholic mystics. He was kidnapped by members of his own monastic order and imprisoned and taken out and beaten so frequently and so regularly that he died young. Francis of Assisi managed to die a normal death, but several hundred of his followers, the most severe Franciscan disciples, were actually burned at the stake by the church as heretics. And to continue this sad story, like Thomas Merton, the 20th century Trappist monk, was on an absolute collision course with his order when he died accidentally and was probably spared the final crash. The church would not have burned him, but they would have thrown him out. So Roman Catholicism, even though it has a really rich tradition of mysticism, is suspicious of it and suspect and tries to keep it down. When I was a Catholic seminary student in the 1960s, this was during the period of something called the Index of Forbidden Books. Up in the attic of the library, there was a metal cage, and locked. And in that metal cage were the forbidden books, things like Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. And there was also John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila and a number of the other great Catholic mystics. And you could only read those books if you had the permission and supervision of the professor of mystic theology, and he was extremely loath to give it. And this kind of a response to mysticism is hardly limited to Catholicism. Protestantism on the whole has been very suspicious of mysticism. You take, for example, in Islam, there is the Sufi branch, which is really based on mysticism. Yet you'll unfortunately notice that when Islamic fundamentalists take over political power in a country, one of the first people they go after is the Sufis. And they try to exterminate them. I mean, it's just that brutal. So, which raises a question. What's the problem with the mystics? Why do established, organized religions in their organizations distrust it so much? I think the reason is its very universality. The fact that you can find mystical experience across all traditions, that it isn't unique to one, that it may have its own form of expression, say in Buddhism versus Roman Catholicism, but ultimately all those experiences are much the same. And there's another part of it, which is that if you can experience the divine and the cosmic, as Jesus did, as Mary Oliver did, on your own, you don't need the church. I mean, it's really politically uncool to be a mystic and be a rising cleric, in a sense, you know? I mean, there's a disjunction there between the organization of churches and the particular form of religious experience known as mysticism. And I think this background of the history of mysticism and its importance is why we Unitarian Universalists really ought to be paying attention to it. I mean, despite all the bad treatment many mystics have gotten, humans absolutely hunger for the mystical. I mean, look at the popularity of Mary Oliver. I just knew putting her name in the title of this sermon would bring people. I mean, she is the best-selling American poet, period. I mean, it's quite stunning. And she doesn't only write about mysticism, but she has this stunning ability to talk about, to express, and to connect with people around this notion of the ineffable and the connected and to some extent the universal. I have taught her poetry in various classes and workshops in all kinds of settings, both religious and non-religious, and I've had Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Hindus, and they all go completely ape over her work. So there's something in there that is really appealing across a very wide spectrum of religious hunger. The same thing is actually true of Rumi. I mean, in the past 20 to 30 years, Rumi has become very popular in this country, largely to the really brilliant translations by Coleman Barks. But it speaks to the way that Rumi talks in a language and to a need that an awful lot of people share and really want to know more about. And there have been even minor boomlets in the poetry of people like Kabir and Mirabai and a personal favorite, St. John of the Cross. They have all become more widely known, better translated, and talked about in communities like I've heard there's a translation of John of the Cross done by a Jewish mystic about John of the Cross who was nothing but a Catholic. So there's a remarkable kind of cross-fertilization and an interest. I want to be really clear that mysticism is not a proof point for the existence of God. That's not what it's about. Barbara Ehrenreich stands there as a wonderful point of data to tell us that even atheists have mystical experiences. It underscores rather the idea, which is very explicit in many Native American religions, that consciousness is not a property of the human mind. It does not reside in the human mind. The human mind resides in consciousness. In other words, the conscious universe, the world around us that has meaning, that has a kind of an ability to communicate with us and to connect with us, is much bigger than we are. And that's often what happens in a mystical experience. You'll notice that Jesus sees the Spirit in what form? A dove. It's an animal. And Mary Oliver sees a certain kind of God or divine experience, a cosmic experience, in the form of an alligator crashing through the underbrush. So I think we Unitarian Universalists can and should begin embracing the mystic traditions. And there's a couple reasons for this. One is we do really, really well with outcasts, outlaws, visionaries, and renegades. Our ranks are thinned this morning by the Gay Pride weekend because we're so involved in people who used to be on the margins and have now come towards the center. And we could do the same with the whole idea of mysticism and those mystical writers, particularly poets, who really can express that. And there's that seventh principle of Unitarian Universalism: respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. We tend to practice that intellectually, by having good green politics and following well thought through environmental policy. But mysticism takes that from an intellectual point of view into a deeply felt emotional understanding of the world, a whole way of seeing the world. That in the same way as Jesus going into that synagogue or Mary Oliver writing that poem about the alligator, they feel that with a depth that is way beyond the intellect. This isn't just good green politics. This is a green soul, and that's something we can embrace. The deepening and the widening of mystical experience connects us into this wider world, and we begin to understand that we are all inextricably connected, one with another, one with every animal that lives around here, all the plants, and even what the Buddhists love to call the non-living beings, like the soil and the rock and the earth itself. When we begin to understand our human and non-human neighbors as parts of ourselves, as beings who are deserving of respect and nurturance, everything changes. We don't just know it, we feel it. And when we tell others about this, when we actually speak from that principle of respect, then we too, like Jesus in the synagogue and Mary Oliver in her poem, speak with authority. And we help to create that same connection among other people within this community and in the larger community. So in recognition of inviting into our midst the much abused and much needed mystical, I'd like us to rise in body or spirit and join our voices in a wonderful text